Okay, so thank you for staying along until the last presentation. So it's going to present a paper with one of the two David Bardet. And so it's a paper about the welfare impact of genetic testing in the health insurance market. So the advantage of being the last in this conference is that I will be able to free ride a lot on a lot of different presentations from yesterday and from this morning. So I'm going to start by skipping the definition from personalized medicine and say that basically we're interested in the settings where the genetic test, they give you a probability of developing the disease in some future time. And especially they allow you to do something with this information. That is, this something can be either to do some kind of prevention or to get a more specific treatment. So we won't talk about the treatment aspect. I think we talked a lot about it this morning. So the paper is basically looking at prevention. And so I'm using slightly different terms from the terms that the other David has used yesterday, self-protection and self-insurance. So it's we call this primary prevention in the case that you decrease the probability of the damage, and we call secondary prevention when you decrease the severity of the illness. So we will be about primary prevention. Now I will also skip mostly this slide because I think that several people, including Mike yesterday, talked about that there is, as for the moment, there is quite little actionable health information for prevention that you can get from genetic tests. So you mentioned several different books yesterday. I don't know if you are aware of this book by Snyder.
Yes, very good.
Yeah, with the chair of the Department of Genetics at Stanford. And basically that's the main point that he makes, that for the moment there is still little actionable health information except in very specific diseases, or even for these diseases, this prevention is very costly. We talked about the PRCA test, where the prevention that we can do is mastectomy, which is something which is really has a high cost, not only a financial cost, but of course a very high psychological and personal cost. So another thing that we have now is a very low genetic test take-up rate. And the third thing, and of course these three things are probably linked, is that if you look at the health insurance market, you see mostly pooling contracts and not separating contracts. That is, the insurers, they don't try to disentangle what is your genetic background, whether you have done a test or not. This is not something that exists for the moment. And so the existing contracts are pooling, and so there is a lot of cross-subsidies between the genetic types of the people who buy the same contract. But of course, as Anya said, all the action is not now, but in the future, or in the near future. So the point made by the same book is that in the future, there will be the first thing is that we will see further decreases in the cost of the genetic test. So these costs have decreased much faster than even Moore's law would predict. And some people think that they will now get cheaper, and they will be even cheaper tomorrow. And this is something that a large part of the economics literature has focused on. But we think that what is equally important is that we hope that there will be a commensurate increase in the informativeness of the test that we will measure by some kind of efficiency cost ratio of the kind of prevention that you can get. Either the prevention will be very efficient if you are discovered to have this allele or this gene, very efficient in decreasing your risk of developing the disease if you do some prevention, or the cost of the prevention will decrease in the future. And we think also that more and more people, thanks to this, will do the test, because the test will be cheaper, the test will be more informative, there will be more things that you can do with the information generated by the test. And so probably, or hopefully, I don't know what to say, more people will take genetic tests. Now the questions addressed by this specific paper is, well, if we observe all this, more people taking the test, more efficient prevention or less costly prevention technology, will the pooling contracts that we currently observe in the market, will they survive? Or will we move to more separating contracts where we lose these cross-subsidies? And as a public economist, I tend to like cross-subsidies because basically it benefits the worse off in society, as we will see here. And so more generally, what are the welfare impacts of first higher test take-up rates and second, of having more informative genetic tests. So this is what we want to do today. Now, talking a little bit on the literature, now I will free ride on David's presentation of yesterday. So he talked about this paper by Doherty and Thistle, which was one of the very first papers to study the incentives to gather information in insurance markets with adverse selection. So one example being taking a genetic test. And of course, they do stress the importance of what is observable, so your status, meaning whether you have taken a test or not, and your type, which is if you have taken a test, whether the test was positive or negative, whether you have a good or bad, with quotes, genetic background. Now, there is a whole lot of subsequent literature, and many people in this room have contributed to this literature. Basically, we have started from a similar setting, but they added prevention to this setting. So either primary prevention, where you decrease the probability of getting sick. So Richard has contributed to this literature, and David and I, we have a paper on this. Or you can add some secondary prevention, like David did in the past. He also cited a paper by Marie-Louise Leroux yesterday. Now, these papers, they most of them, not all of them, but most of them share two assumptions. The first being that all individuals are ex ante identical, meaning that they have the same benefits and the same cost of testing, which means that at equilibrium, either they will all decide to take genetic test or none will test. And so this is not something that is that corresponds to what you observe in reality, where in reality you have a small fraction, but which is not zero when you take the test, and we think that in the future it will increase, but it will not move to 100%. The second thing is that most papers, I mean, like maybe 90 or 95% of the literature on insurance contracts, they focus on the very nice separating contracts following Stiglitz. But of course, for the moment, it's not what we observe for genetic tests. We observe pooling contracts. So there are exceptions to this. So exception to the first ex ante identical agents is this paper by Hull and co-authors, where they have heterogeneity in psychological cost. And so there is also a paper by Mike and Richard with aversion to ambiguity. But in that paper, I'm not sure I remember, but I think you don't have heterogeneity. I think you have, everybody has the same. Anyway. Okay. Exceptions to the second point, so exceptions which are papers, we do consider some pooling contract. Well, basically everybody is in the room. There are two papers by Mike and one paper by David, considering also pooling equilibria. But to the best of our knowledge, there is no paper with both a test take-up rate, which is intermediate, which is neither 0 nor 1, and at the same time, you can have in the model both pooling and separating equilibrium. So the model will tell you which type of equilibrium, pooling or separating, you will get at equilibrium. Now, the outline of the talk, so I will start by spending 5 minutes on Wilson's approach. So basically what I will do is take slide 11 from David yesterday, the left column of the table. So when he was showing us the 4 types of contracts we can get, so you gave a verbal explanation, and I will give an explanation based on a figure, because I know that Marie-Louise loves figures. So, okay, that's another way of presenting the thing. Now, all our paper is based on Wilson's approach. So I knew that for some of you, you could do this in your sleep, but I thought that for the other person, which are maybe less familiar with Wilson's approach, that would be worth it going through it in 5 minutes. Then I will tell you how our setup differs from that of Wilson. Then we will say, well, if the contracts at equilibrium are separating contracts, how do they look like? Then if they were pooling contracts, what would they look like? And then the core of the paper is in section 6 and 7. In section 6, we look at which type of contract will emerge at equilibrium. Will it be separating or pooling? And in the 7th part, we do some welfare analysis. So some comparative statistics. We look at how utilities of agents and welfare change when more people take the test, and also when the test becomes more informative. Now, first, Wilson's approach. So from pooling, or separating to pooling equilibrium. So the approach is very simple. You only have two types. You have type L with a low probability of damage and type H with a high probability and a proportion of each type. And you have two states of the world. One is for the good state of the world where you have no damage, and two is for the bad state where the damage occurs, and the damage is purely monetary. So we will look at welfare in state 1 and welfare in state 2. Now, it's not because Mike is in the room, because I gave the same presentation a few months ago in other places, but I think that really the best way to explain what is going on with Wilson is to take this picture, which is taken from a paper by Mike, where he shows what is going on. So what you have here on the horizontal axis is the wealth in the good state of the world, vertical axis wealth in the bad state of the world. And so if you have no insurance, the endowment point is E, where you have W1 larger than W2. Now you can buy some kind of insurance against the damage occurring, and you have these two types of agents, L and H. And so if the insurer can observe your type, if you have a competitive fringe of insurers, so they will compete and make no profit, and so they will each offer, to each of the two types, they will offer a contract which is actually fair. So this is the type of contract they will offer to type H, this straight line. So of course, if you want to have more wealth in state 2, you have to pay some premium in state 1. And here you have the same thing for type L, and of course the slope here is much higher because type L is less risky. So he can have both more wealth in both states of the world because he will pay a smaller premium. Now, if you can observe these two types, you offer this contract to type H, it's actually fair. So we know that he will buy full insurance, that's the Mossin result that David mentioned yesterday. And so full insurance means that you have the same wealth in both states of the world, and so type H will buy this contract P. And type L will buy contract A. So that would be the two contracts that you would observe with symmetric information. Now, if you have asymmetric information, people know their type, but the insurer doesn't know their type. You cannot propose A and B. Why? Because A is much better than B for type H. So type H will mimic type L, pretenses of type L. And so everybody would buy contract A, and the insurance would make a huge loss. So what would happen? Two things can happen. You can have a separating equilibrium. In a separating equilibrium, basically, you want to prevent type H from mimicking type L. And you do this by degrading the contract that you offer to type L. And perfect competition makes sure that the unit price of insurance for type L will remain actually fair, which means that you go back on this straight line up to the point where the type H is exactly the same utility with point B and with point C. So basically, you observe two contracts. Both contracts are actually fair. The contract for the risky type has full insurance. The contract for the not so risky type will have partial insurance. So that's the typical Rothschild-Stiglitz equilibrium. Okay, that's one possibility, the separating equilibrium. The other possibility is to have a pooling equilibrium where you offer a single contract and the contract is bought by the two types. So in order for the insurers to break even, the premium that they have to charge should be equal to the average risk in the economy. Okay, so a weighted average of the risk, the probability of H and the probability of N. So take it to be something like this. So that would be, the dotted line would be the unique contract that you offer to both types of agents and which is based on the average risk in the economy. You see here that if you draw the indifference curve of type L through point C, you see that type L is really not interested in buying this average, this pooling contract. So the only type which would buy this pooling contract is type H, and so it's not an equilibrium because the insurers would lose money. On the other hand, if this pooling contract is not this dotted line P1, but the straight line P2 here, the full line P2, you see that these points here would give more utility to both type L and both type H, so they would attract the two types of individual. So this is what we get on this figure, where the slope of P2 is such that you would have a pooling equilibrium, and in a pooling equilibrium, the coverage rate is always chosen by the guy who has the lowest risk. The highest risk guy, well, he's very happy because he's paying a premium which is either lower than his risk. So he would like more than full insurance, like yesterday in your paper. But the low risk guy pays something which is more costly than actually fair, and so he would prefer quantity. And so in a nutshell, what determines whether we are in the separating equilibrium or in the pooling equilibrium is the slope of this constraint, which is determined by the fraction of high risk type. And so we get the conclusion is that if there are sufficiently many bad types, so high risk type in the economy, we get a separating equilibrium, and otherwise, if the proportion is low enough, we get a pooling equilibrium. Okay, that's what I wanted to remind you with the Wilson's approach. Okay? So, our model is a bit more complicated, and you will see why. So there are, to start with, it is the same. So you have two types of agent, the low probability types, and you have the high probability type with proportion lambda and 1 minus lambda proportion for the low probability type. But not everybody knows this type. To know your type, you need to have taken, for example, some genetic test. And not everyone has taken a test. So if you have not taken the test, if you have no information, basically you are uninformed. So we call you of type U, even though actually you are L or H, but you don't know it. So basically you think you are of type U, where the best information that you get is that your probability is the average probability of having the disease in the population. And the important assumption is that we assume that there is an exogenous proportion K of agents who did the test who are informed. And so this means that out of this K proportion, there is a lambda proportion which is H. So we have K times lambda H type in the economy, K times 1 minus lambda of type L, and we have 1 minus K, a fraction 1 minus K of type U agents in the economy. And so the very big difference with David's paper, but with most papers in this literature, is that we will always have the three types. So we have to think about the contracts that we will offer to type L, to type U, and to type H, because there will be type U at equilibrium. So the disease there, we are, not as advanced as the paper you presented yesterday. The disease is simply the same financial damage for all sick individuals. And in terms of prevention effort, we assume that it's only binary. So it's either 0 or 1. You do the prevention effort or you don't. And we make the usual assumption that the prevention is especially useful if you have so-called bad genes. So I think that's quite standard in the literature, saying that if you are sick, it's because you have a combination of a bad genetic background and a bad environment, and here a bad environment would be not to do the prevention effort. And so what we need is that basically the prevention effort is more efficient at reducing the probability of developing the damage for type H. But for simplicity, we go all the way and we assume that prevention has no impact on the risk of type L and has only an effect on the risk of type H. And of course, as for type U, he's intermediate because he knows that there is a lambda probability that it is here and the 1 minus lambda probability of being of type L. So his prevention effort will only work with probability lambda. So that would be the benefit of the prevention, but of course the prevention has a cost. We take it to be a utility cost for simplicity, it doesn't matter much. And this cost is basically what we will take this as a proxy of the informativeness of the genetic test. The more actionable health information you get from the test, the lower is the prevention cost. So the cost of the prevention effort, that is especially useful if the test discovers that you are of the type H. So that's exactly what was said about BRCA, I think it was yesterday. For the moment, the main thing that you can do is have a mastectomy, and we can hope that in the future there will be other things that we can tell women that they can do in order to reduce their risk other than just this surgery. We hope that the prevention will be less costly. Yeah, Mike?
I just think for the sake of generalities, since there are a lot of actions which do help the low risk type as well, suppose, for example, likelihood of type 2 diabetes, even if you're a low risk type, being cautious is a good idea. If you just make the impact of the low risk type small enough from taking the action that it's never worth the cost, then you could have the same setup, I would think.
And or you could we can keep it binary, but not 0, 1, low level, high level. Everybody will always do the low level prevention, because even if they are of type L, it's worth it, and we are interested in the increase in the prevention. So I think it can be generalized that way as well. I don't think it's not crucial.
It's not a red flag to me, but it would be to some referees.
Okay.
As I've discovered.
Okay. It's good to know. It can save us a lot of time. Thank you very much. So the other assumptions that we are making, the classical one that we have a competitive fringe of insurers, and so the profit will be equal to 0 at equilibrium, whether the equilibrium is separating or pooling, so that will not be the driving force. In terms of the regulation and of what is observable, we will assume that prevention is both observable and contractable by the insurers. So there is no moral hazard. So we are currently working on a paper where there is both adverse selection and moral hazard. It's really complicated, so this one is simpler, no moral hazard. And in terms of regulation, we want a regulation where there is adverse selection. And basically, we took one which is called consent law, and here I talk under, I may stand corrected by Anya, who's a specialist on this. So the consent law regulation, used I think in the Netherlands and in Switzerland, is such that you are absolutely not obliged to reveal that you have taken a genetic test to your insurer, but if you want to, you can do it. So it's really up to you to decide whether you want to give the information to the insurer. So it will generate, of course, adverse selection, as in the other regulation, which are much more used in many more countries. So the strict prohibition regulations, like those you mentioned in Canada, for instance, where you are not, I mean, it's illegal to give the information to the insurer, but as the other David mentioned earlier, it doesn't prevent, I mean, it doesn't solve the adverse selection problem, because as we will see, you can have Rothschild-Stiglitz kind of contracts where you manage to target the low risk and the high risk using some coverage level. So the reason we use consent law rather than strict prohibition is that it makes our life a bit simpler, because in this model, those who are tested and have good genes, low risk of developing the disease, they will of course reveal the result of the test, because they are very happy. They will receive complete coverage at a fair price from the insurer, and the fair price is very low, it's the lowest in the economy, and moreover, they know that they're of L types, and so they know that they don't bother doing the effort. Or they will do the minimum amount of effort that everybody is doing. So when I will say a separating versus a pooling equilibrium, I always mean between types U and H, because type L here, they will always receive the best contract, and this contract won't change, won't be affected by anything in the model. So the question is that whether the insurers will either pool types U and H together, or whether they will try to separate them using this Rothschild-Stiglitz contract. Now, let's look at the separating equilibrium first, and look at what the separating contracts first, and look at their characteristic at equilibrium. So I've reminded you that in a separating contract, the bad type, which here is H type, will always receive complete coverage at a fair price. So price equal to its probability of developing the disease, pH. Now we are more general than the typical Wilson-Rothschild-Stiglitz model, in the sense that for type U, well, there are two ways here that you can prevent type H from mimicking type U. There is the usual way where you will under-provide insurance to the U type. You will not reimburse 100% of the damage, but a smaller fraction. But there is also another dimension, which is the prevention dimension. So if you want, you can require a different prevention effort for types U and for type H. So for example, you can have a contract which is designed for type H, telling it, you should do the effort, it's worth for it, do it, but for type U, you say, if you buy the contract for type U, you don't do the effort, okay? And so that will be another way to change the utility that type H can get from mimicking type U. And so the question is, will we use one, the first, the second, or both in these dimensions to separate the types? And well, I spare you the maximum of notation and of computations. I mean, if you had a look at the paper, the core of the paper is not very long. It's 25 pages, and then we have more than 20 pages of proofs. So I didn't think, I would have liked to show the proof to a few of you, usual suspects, but I don't think it was fair for the rest of the audience. So I will just summarize the result. And I think the result makes sense. First of all, in a separating contract, the proportion of types H and U does not matter. If you go back to this, in a separating contract, here, B and C, the proportion of type H and of type L in this setting doesn't matter. So in our setting is the same thing for the proportion of U and H type. So the only thing that matters is the cost of the effort. And what we get is very intuitive. If the cost of the effort is low enough, then in a separating contract, you will not play with this dimension. You will require effort for both types. So that may be the only notation that you really need to know. S is for a separating contract, and then there are two digits, 0 and 1. The first one is whether type U is making the effort. The second one is whether type H is making the effort. So if the effort is not costly at all, then at equilibrium, both will do the effort, and so all the separation will be in the usual way in a lower coverage rate for type H. If the polar case, if the cost of the effort is large enough, then we are back in the traditional case where nobody does the effort. It's a S00 contract, and all the action is also on the under coverage dimension. The more interesting case is the intermediate one. If phi is intermediate, then basically you will separate the two types in part by asking type H to do the effort, but by telling him if you try to buy the contracts for type U, which is cheaper, of course, then you are provided from doing the effort. You don't do the effort. And so in that case, you will really use the two dimensions. Probably you will also have to under-provide insurance to type U, but moreover, you will have a different prevention effort for the type H. So that's one new thing in the paper. Okay? I haven't lost you yet with the result. So 3 types of separating. If the equilibrium is separating, for the moment we don't know yet, but if it is separating, 3 types of contracts depending on whether the two do the effort, only one, type H, and or that of the two. Now we move to the pooling contract. So we offer a single contract. This contract is a price which reflects the composition of the pool, the fraction of type U, the fraction of type H. And so, of course, it depends on K. So K is the proportion of people who have tested. So basically, it's the proportion of people of bad type in the pool is increasing in K. And so the price of the insurance will be increasing in K. In terms of effort, here it's a pooling equilibrium. So you have to ask the same effort level to the 2 types of agents. You offer one contract, everybody buys the contract, you don't know who is U, who is H, you cannot condition the effort on the type. And so you will only have 2 types of pooling equilibria, either a pooling, so P, with no effort, or a pooling with effort. And as we saw with the Wilson's approach, the coverage rate will be chosen by the lowest type among the 2, which is type U. And so this case is at the same time simpler than the separating because we only have 2 types of equilibria. On the other hand, it's more complex because these equilibria are affected not only by the cost of the effort, which will determine whether you are at P0 or P1, but it will be also affected by K because K increases the price of the pooling equilibrium. And so what we establish is also quite intuitive, although it's incredible, these intuitive. Yeah, I've seen it. Let me take my picture. It's there's nothing I can do about it. There is the result is intuitive, but it's still not easy to prove. David took a lot of time to prove that one. So whatever the value of K, there is a threshold value of phi such that if phi is low enough, lower than this threshold, we are in a pooling equilibrium where everybody does the test. The effort, sorry, not the test, the effort, the prevention effort. And if the cost of the effort is large enough, then people don't do the effort. What is really complicated is this thing. And I mean, it's non-monotone in K, it doesn't have a lot of properties that you can assess, it's really very complicated. Okay, so that's the pooling equilibrium. If the equilibrium is pooling, they look like this. Yeah.
So maybe I missed that, but the K, how is the K determined, or is that exogenous?
It's exogenous.
I see.
It's exogenous.
So that's different from what many papers do, where
it's not about the value of the
I see,
information.
okay.
Yeah, because in order to endogenize the K, we would need to have
another fringe. Yeah.
Yeah, you would need to have heterogeneous
agents.
agents. They should differ according to something, and so that would be more complicated. And second, we really want to do some comparative statics with respect to the K, so we want to be able to change the K. But that would be some nice extension. Yeah.
Just a clarification question. So, to sort out the uninformed and the high risk, you said, okay, there is the insurance coverage, the traditional way, and then the prevention efforts.
Yeah.
So you say, okay, I'm going to propose two different prevention efforts, and what you will have in mind is that the high risk will choose his own contract because he prefers to make the effort that is designed for him. That's it?
Well, a contract is a bundle. It's the price that you pay, it's the coverage rate, and it's a 0-1, whether you do the effort or not.
Okay, but so it means that the high risk will choose their contract, the contract is designed for them, because they want to make the effort.
It's part of the reason. They will compare the price, but of course for the price they would prefer to buy the cheaper contract for the U. They will look at the coverage rate, and for this...
there is also a difference.
We play with the two things at the same time.
Okay.
Okay, so they will, they gain on the price, they lose on one or two of the following things: the coverage rate, as usual. If they buy the contract for type U, they may be undercovered. But in the S01 equilibrium, they also lose on the effort, because they don't do the prevention effort, which is especially efficient for them.
Okay, so you do both.
Yeah, we do both at the same time, and I could show you how they work. I mean, we could spend 15 minutes on this, really on the description of the separating contracts. When you move from one regime to another, that's also interesting. And I wanted to get straight to the point.
I raise this question because if you don't move, if you don't play with the coverage, but only with the effort. This is something you could do because, after all, the IRIS could say, okay, the best thing to do for me is to choose my contract, but at least I can do the effort. But this implies, and that was my question, what do you mean by prevention is observable? Because there are two ways. I had the same problem when I prepared my presentation. When you say that prevention is observable, it can either be because you can prove to your insurer that you did something. Take, for instance, to the connected watch, you say, okay, look, I'm running 10 kilometers per day, okay? This is, for instance.
I told you it's 12.
Oh, yeah.
It used to be 10. But...
Now, what happens if you don't want to show to your insurer that you do the effort?
No, it's
okay.
It's contractable, so it's written in the contract. That
Yeah, but can you do more than what is in the contract?
It's a good question. I think it's not in your interest, because the competition between the insurers will make sure that they try to increase the utility of the agents. Because if they don't do this, then another insurance would come on the market and give you. Okay. So I haven't checked this for type H, but for type U, it's sure that he doesn't have an incentive to do the effort, even though he was not supposed to do it.
Okay, but it was for type H in this case.
Yeah, I'm not that sure. This is something we should check, but there is still this element of competition which tends to improve the utility of the guys. I mean, you don't want to degrade their utility for fun. You want to be really to give the contract that maximizes their utility, subject to the fact that they don't mimic each other. Yeah.
And then another question related to the effort choice. So do you need any additional assumptions for the indifference curves to be well behaved, given that effort choice is endogenous? I remember we had to do some sort of argument in the paper with Paul but I don't quite remember how it went. But we had like continuous effort choice, so maybe it's different because it's binary.
And did you have primary or secondary prevention?
Do you mean?
We had primary, and it can screw up the convexity of the difference curves if you have a continuous effort. So you need to make some restrictions on technologies for the usual screening arguments to go through.
No, for us it's not a problem because if basically the notation is such, if you don't do the effort, you have a probability pH0, which is larger than pH1.
That probably helps on that dimension.
Yeah.
No, but in fact, there is one constraint that it's an assumption that we do, we needn't everywhere, but we do at some portions. Is that when you are high risk and you do some prevention, you will not have a lower probability than the average guy.
Yeah, at some point we have to make this assumption for certain results, but it's
we needn't it everywhere, but at some point.
So I come to the core of the paper, which is basically what we are interested is in the K phi space. So K is the proportion of people who test, phi is the cost of the prevention effort. In this space, which equilibrium will emerge? Will it be a pooling equilibrium or a separating equilibrium? And to remind you, we have three types of separating contracts according only to the value of phi, whether they don't do the effort or both do the effort or only one. And we have only two types of pooling contract, with or without effort, but it depends on both phi and K. And so we have a lot of analytical results, but I will only give you one analytical result, and then I will move to a figure, not only to please Marie-Louise, especially this figure has handwritten things on it.
I saw that.
I know that you like this kind of thing, but simply it's easier to present, but basically nearly everything that I will show on the picture we prove analytically. There are a few things that are related to the example, but most things are general. So what we prove is that whatever the value of phi, there is a unique value of K, so denoted by this K tilde, such that we are in a pooling equilibrium if K is lower than this threshold, and in a separating equilibrium if K is larger than the threshold. That's a kind of generalization of Wilson, because Wilson told you that according to the proportion of high risk, you will have either a separating equilibrium here, or you will have a pooling equilibrium here. So for us, it's a bit more complicated, and especially the threshold is quite complicated. But for the rest, it's the same idea that if K is low enough, you don't have too many H type in the pool, and so you end up with a pooling equilibrium. If K is large enough, you end up in a separating equilibrium. And that's basically our motivation and intuition, what I said on the first slides, that if in the future more people take the test, we think that there is a risk that we would move from a pooling to a separating equilibrium. Now, the big picture. So what we have here on the horizontal axis is the value of K from 0 to 1, and on the vertical axis, we have the value of phi. And we want to put in this graph, all the zones where we have a pooling equilibrium, a separating equilibrium, and which kind. So I will kind of draw the graph with you step by step. The first thing that we have established is that there is this threshold value of K tilde, such that if you are to the left of the threshold, it's a pooling equilibrium, and if you are to the right of the threshold, it's always a separating equilibrium. So this threshold is quite complex. Well, it's simple here and there because it's a constant, but here we prove analytically the sign of the slope. Okay, so it's an ugly beast, but we don't care. We know that whatever this threshold, which exists and is strictly between 0 and 1, to the left we have a pooling equilibrium, to the right we have a separating equilibrium. That's the first building piece. Second building piece is when do we make the effort? So we had that there is this phi tilde of P, such that if phi is low enough, okay, the cost of the effort is low enough in the pooling equilibrium, you do the effort. If you are above this curve, okay, phi is large enough in the pooling equilibrium, you don't do the effort. So we have this zone where we are in a pooling equilibrium without effort. In this zone, we are in a pooling equilibrium with effort. So last thing I have to say is, here we have in separating equilibrium, but which kind? And here it's very simple, because I told you K has no impact on the separating equilibrium, it depends on phi. So if phi is larger than this threshold, which is a straight horizontal line because it doesn't depend on K, then nobody does the effort. We are in the separating without effort. If phi is intermediate between phi max and phi min, we are in this zone where only type H makes the effort and type U doesn't make the effort. And finally, if phi is low enough, we are in this rectangle where both types do the effort. And so we have the 5 types of equilibria that we can generate: the pooling without effort, pooling with effort, and the free separating equilibria depending on the value of phi. Okay? And so what we want to do in the paper is some welfare analysis of varying K and phi. So our idea is that currently we are in a situation up there. Why? Because K is obviously very low, and if you think about the mastectomy example, the cost of the prevention effort is very high. So there is not much actionable health prevention information in genetic tests. So what will happen in the future? Well, we decompose what will happen in 2 stages. The first is that most probably the value of K will increase. And so you can see that if value of K will increase, at some point we will move from pooling to separating equilibrium. But we are interested in how are utilities affected by a higher value of K within P when we move from P0 to S00 and then within S0. So that will be the first section. Second section will be the opposite, the vertical dimension. Okay, if we get more information, we translate this into a lower cost of the effort, and we will move from, for example, an interesting case would be P0, then we cross the border to S01, and then we go to P1. So that's one possibility. So we will do this analytically. Finally, we will do the 2 things together, but of course we cannot do this analytically because it will depend on the relationship, on the speed, the relative speed of the increase in K and decrease in phi. So I will show you an example, a numerical example, where basically we go in this direction. And we try to see what will come. Okay, so let's start with an increase in K. But before this, I have to tell you what is our measure of welfare. We took the simplest one, which is the utilitarian welfare. That is, you take the utilities of type U, which is VU, type H, which is VH, and type L, which is VL. But this is a constant, so it's really not interesting. And we weight the utility of the 3 types by their proportion in the population. So the proportion sum to 1. So for instance, to be of type H, you need to know the information. So K fraction is tested, and out of the K fraction, only lambda fraction is of type H. So if you increase A, remember, we start in the pooling contract. What is the impact of increasing K? Well, there are 2 impacts. The first one I told you, when K increases, it means that there are more high-risk people in the pool, and so it increases the price of the contract. And of course, that's not good for the agents. They don't like it. So you have a decrease in the utility of U, a decrease in the utility of, it should be an L, not an H, sorry. And of course, mechanically, welfare will decrease. But there is also another effect which we call a composition effect, because when you change K, you change the proportion of the 3 types. So when you increase K, you have more tested agents, so you have more type L, more type H agents, but at the same time, you have fewer people of type U. So it's a composition. And a priori, you don't know which way it goes, because these guys have very high utility, these guys very low utility, and these guys are in between. But analytically, we can show that the impact is always positive. So the composition effect is always a positive impact. And so analytically, basically the net impact is ambiguous because this impact is negative on welfare, this impact is positive on welfare, and so the net impact is in general ambiguous. So we know that when we increase K in a pooling contract, U types and H types are worse off, but because of the change in the composition of society, we don't know whether welfare actually increases or decreases when we use this welfare. Of course, and I will come back to this at the end, if you think that insurance, is especially interesting for the individuals who are unlucky, they do the test and they discover that they have a very high probability of disease, they will pay a very high, they will be the worst off agents in society, because here in a pooling contract, they don't have full insurance. In a separating contract, they will have full insurance, but they will pay it at a very high cost. If you care a lot about them, and if you go all the way, you take, for example, rather than a simple utilitarian function, you take a maximin one, where you want to maximize the minimum utility, that is to maximize VH, then of course the net impact here would be negative. You would forget about the composition effect, you would care only about VH, and so VH would be lower. So more people testing is bad for in a pooling contract. Yeah?
So I have a question about the composition effect. Because if
I didn't know you would have, but I would have been ready to wage money on it.
So I was wondering how we should think about welfare in that case, because, I mean, if we think about it there's high risks and low risks. The only thing that we change here is whether people know that there are high risk and low risk, right? But effectively, the composition hasn't changed, right? Because in the remainder of the use, there's still going to be some high risks and low risks.
We change their contracts, because if you test and discover you're of type L, you're very happy. So there will be more very happy people. And even among the U and the H, even if they buy the same contract, since the contract doesn't have full coverage, ex ante, you don't have the same utility. Because if you know that you're of type H, your utility is worse than if you don't know and think you are of average type. So you really change the ex ante utility of individuals.
Okay. So the composition effect is through the contract, right?
Well, for the composition effect, we keep the contract unchanged, but VU, basically we have VL, which is higher than VU, which is higher than VH. And of course, depending on the gap between VU and VH and VU and VL, the composition impact could be negative or positive, but we are able to show that it's always positive.
I'm sorry, I think, of course, you said it in the very beginning, but I don't remember. How do the uninformed people decide to be uninformed?
It's exogenous. In this paper, there is a fraction of people who know and the others do not. So for genetic tests, you did take the test or not, but you can have another interpretation in terms of family history. Some people have a revealing family history. All your forefathers were centenarians or whatever, so you know you're type L, or you know you're type H, or most people, they don't know their type. They are just average. But it's not a decision. It's not, we don't endogenize this. Because we play with this. We increase the fraction of people who are.
Yeah.
Then if you are in a separating contract, as I told you, as I reminded you, in a separating contract, K has no impact on the contract, so you only have this composition impact. K doesn't affect VU, VH, VL. You only have the separation contract, the composition impact, sorry, and so unambiguously welfare is increased by more people taking the test. Now what is interesting, of course, is whether you have a discontinuity at the value of K such that you suddenly move from a pooling to a separating equilibrium. Now, the utility of U is always continuous because you have seen that in the Wilson's approach, you go from pooling to separating basically when type U is indifferent between the two. So you want to maximize the utility of the two. So basically, there is no discontinuity for the utility of U, but we established analytically that there is a discontinuity for type H, and it always jumps downward when you move from P to S. So in a pooling, so the trade-off between pooling and separating contract for type H is that when you move from pooling to separating, you have a price effect. The contract becomes much more expensive because it is based on your risk rather than the average risk. On the other hand, you gain in coverage because in P you get partial coverage and in S you get full coverage. So this means that the price effect is always larger than the coverage effect, and type H, they always lose discontinuously when we move from pooling to separating. So in a nutshell, the result is that increasing K has an ambiguous impact on welfare if pooling, but what we know is that it's especially bad for H types when you go from P to S. These are the worst off people in society, and these are the ones who suffer really bad when you move from pooling to separating. Now, you may ask, what is the global maximum for welfare. So it has to be either at k equal to 0, nobody tests, and we have a pooling equilibrium. In that case, I took it to be the pooling with effort, or everybody tests and you have a separating equilibrium. And basically, we show that the maximum welfare, depending on the value of the parameters, can be one or the other. It's not always the case. Okay, so it's not always the case that the highest welfare level is reached when everybody tests and we have a separating equilibrium, or that when nobody tests and we have a pooling equilibrium. We have numerical examples with both configurations, which are this. So that was the impact of moving horizontally on this graph, increasing k. Now I'm going to see the impact of decreasing the value of phi, or having an effort which is less costly. So of course, if you decrease phi, there is no composition effect. Composition comes from the fraction of uninformed people, which is k, and phi has nothing to do with it. Also, what is very simple is that if you are in a pooling contract and you have and you don't do the effort, then of course the cost of the effort has no impact on your utility. On the other hand, if you are in a pooling contract where everybody does the effort, of course, decreasing the value of phi will be good to everybody. Everybody is doing the effort, and so everybody likes doing an effort which is less costly. So that's really very simple. In a separating contract, it's somehow similar. If you are in the separating contract where nobody does the effort, of course, the cost of the effort has no impact. And if you are in a separating contract where H does the effort, whether U doesn't or does not, then a lower value of phi is always increasing VU and VH. And here it may be surprising that VU is affected even in this case, because in this case U is not making the effort. But what we show is that when you change the value of phi, there is the obvious direct impact that if you have to pay this cost, you are happy when the cost is lower. But you have an indirect effect through the higher coverage. So when you decrease the value of phi, it allows the insurer to offer a higher coverage rate to type U. And so type U is benefiting from this lower cost of the effort, even though it doesn't make the effort. But simply because the insurance will distort less its contract on the other dimension, the coverage dimension. So that's kind of fun. Now what happens really when we move suddenly from pooling to separating equilibrium? We still have the continuity in the utility of individual U. And for H, we show that there is one case where the utility decreases discontinuously. It's when we move from P0 to S01. So to come back to this slide, when we move from P0 here or here, we decrease phi, and suddenly we move to S01, it's really very bad for the type H agents. And so the result, okay, is that, well, most of the result in terms of phi is very intuitive. Decreasing phi is either neutral or beneficial to everyone, except in one very specific circumstance. Decreasing phi is very bad for the type H, and so for welfare as well, when you move suddenly from the pooling with no effort to the separating where only type H does the effort. So that's what I have for analytical results. The rest is numerical results. What I'm doing is basically starting from the top left corner, and I'm increasing K and decreasing phi along a straight line, and I chose, well, the most interesting line, which starts here, P0, then moves to S01, and then goes back to a pooling, but this time a pooling with effort. So I go there, there, and then there. And I have the graph, and normally on the PC I know how to enlarge the graph, but of course this is a Mac.
You want me to help you or really?
No, I think it's still on the PC. I would do it better, but it's okay if you bear with me. So on the horizontal axis, so here I have the utility of type U, here the utility of type H, and I will talk about welfare later on. So I have the value of K, and here I have a formula, and it's a linear formula telling you that phi is linearly decreasing with K. Okay, there is an intercept and then a slope. And here I have the utility. So I have three zones. So if K is low enough, so up to that point, I am in a P0 equilibrium. Here, medium range, I am in a S01 equilibrium. And at the top here, for K large, I'm in a P1 equilibrium, because phi is very low. So in a P0 equilibrium, okay, when I increase K, K has no impact on the utility of both types. But remember, when I increase K, I also decrease phi. So the reason that when I increase K, I decrease phi. Ah, okay, no, I should do it the other way. I should start with, so I'm suddenly confused. So when K is low, phi is high. Okay, so we are, okay. When K is low, phi is high. So it's the opposite. When K is low, phi is high. So we are in a pooling equilibrium where nobody does the effort. That's the P0. So in P0, phi does not impact the utility of the individuals. But K has this price effect. So when increase K, the pooling contract becomes more expensive, and this is why the utility of the two types, H and U, is decreasing. Now there is a stark contrast because the utility of H decreases at a much faster rate than the utility of U. And the reason is that in the pooling contract, the coverage rate is chosen by U. So the guy U are not happy that the contract is more expensive, but at least they can react to this by adapting the amount of insurance that they buy. Type H are very unhappy because the contract becomes more expensive, but it's still more than actually fair for them. It's still a very good deal, but they get rationed more and more because type U is buying less and less of this pooling contract. So this is why the utility is decreasing. Okay, now we move from pooling to separating, and you see that it's really very bad for type H agents. They lose a lot of utility. When you increase K, you are a separating equilibrium. K has no impact on the utility. But when you increase K, you decrease phi, you decrease the cost of the effort. You are in the S01 equilibrium, so type H is making the effort, so there is a direct impact of the effort being cheaper. And for type U, they don't do the effort, but I've just told you that in this equilibrium, when phi decreases, they get more coverage. Okay? And so the reason their utility increases slightly is because they get more and more coverage as phi decreases. And finally, when you move back from separating to pooling, you have the reverse jump. You have that it's very good for type H. Okay, you have no such jump for type U. And then as you increase further the value of K, you get that the impact of K should be negative on the utility, but at the same time you decrease phi. And so you see that the positive impact of phi on the utility is much larger than the negative impact of K on the utility, so the net impact is very positive. Okay. When you aggregate these preferences using the value of K, you get welfare here. And so what you get is that when I told you that I couldn't sign analytically the impact of K on welfare for the pooling, here numerically I get that when you increase K in the pooling, so this is P0, you get a negative impact. While when I increase K in the pooling with effort, I get a very positive impact. Okay. And in between, I get also a positive impact. Okay. So you see that the impact, if you think that this is the future of insurance in the sense that this is what is going to happen to welfare when K increases and phi decreases, we start here. You see that in the short run, it's not very good, because utility will decrease with pooling, basically because the pooling contract becomes more expensive. It will be really bad when we move from pooling to separating. But at least when we are in a separating contract, further increases in K with decreases in phi will have positive impact on welfare. So let me conclude with what I take, and I will see whether David agrees with me, because we finished the paper on Monday, so we didn't have that much time to discuss about this. So what I take to be the two main messages of this paper in terms of the impact of an increase in take-up rates and also an increase in the informativeness of the test measured by an hour cost of the prevention effort, is that in the short run, the impact of a higher take-up rate is quite negative. Okay, it's bad for UNH in a pooling contract. It may be bad for welfare as well if the composition effect is not too strong. And especially moving from pooling to separating is really bad for type H. So in the short run, encouraging individuals to take a test will tend to decrease aggregate welfare, according to this model. In the long run, it's much different, because even if we move from pooling to separating equilibrium at some point, in the long run, provided that we have a large enough increase in the test informativeness, that is a large enough decrease in phi, we may move back to a pooling equilibrium with prevention efforts. And so basically the main message I take from this is that in many papers, including a previous paper of ours, we really focus a lot on the cost of the test. But for me, it's not what is most important. After having read this book, after having written this paper with David, I really think that we should put more focus on what is the amount of actionable health information that we get from the test. And if in the future, the rate of increase of this health information that we get from the test is large enough, then the prospects are much better in terms of health insurance market, and especially in terms of welfare, than if we only have cheaper tests that do not tell us that much more about what we can do in terms of prevention effort. And I will finish here. Thank you.